Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our program on environmental attitudes and innovation in rural America. We're very pleased to present this program today in cooperation with ConservAmerica and the Nicholasinstitute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. I am Dan Fiorino. I'm director of the Center for Environmental Policy at American University. We are part of the School of Public Affairs. We're all about exploring and promoting ways of improving environmental governance and decision-making in the United States. And this program today links with two other big events we've done in the last year. Last April, we did a conference with the American University Law School on EPA and the future of environmental protection. And then in November, we did a program with the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies on environmental protection for the 21st century. So this goes in sort of in the flow of those kinds of programs as we think big picture about environmental policy and our ability to solve the kind of problems that we're all facing. So we all know that we're in a situation where US politics is highly polarized. Much of this division reflects urban-rural divisions. But are these divisions really as fundamental as we think? Are there ways of making progress and improving our ability to deal with environmental issues when we build upon shared values and goals? So those are the kinds of questions that we're going to explore today. We are pleased to have as our speakers today, first I'll give short introductions and then we'll move into the program. William K. Reilly, of course, former EPA administrator, former president of the World Wildlife Fund, a distinguished environmental and energy leader in the United States and a good friend to the School of Public Affairs and American University. Robert Bonney, an executive in residence with the Nicholasinstitute at Duke University. Previously, Robert was the Undersecretary for Natural Resources and the Environment at the US Department of Agriculture. Erin Fitzgerald. Erin is Chief Executive Officer of the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, based in St. Louis, and Brent Fewell, who is General Counsel with ConservAmerica and founder of the Earth and Water Group. So in our program today, we're going to begin with remarks from Bill Reilly. Robert then will give you some highlights from the report that he did, and this program builds on the report that Robert did, so I think that sets the stage nicely. We'll get some reactions from Erin and Brent, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we will take questions from all of you who are participating in this event. We had about over 300 people registered from literally all across the country, urban, rural, and suburban. So we're interested in hearing what kinds of questions you might ask, and we hope that we can build on this and do some kinds of activities in the future. So for questions, you can send questions in via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And you send those in and we'll take the ones we can in the last part of our program. So let's begin. Bill Reilly is going to offer us some remarks. Bill has had extensive experience working with environmental issues in rural America and so on. So Bill, please.
Admire and respect this project, its rigor, its academic care, and the degree to which obviously Robert Bonney and his team went to try to get a variety of regional outlooks on rural relationships and rural people's views. There are a number of reasons for my own background in this. One was suggested, has been over the years, by conversations that I've had with the first EPA administrator and my own much admired mentor, Bill Ruckelshaus, who died a few months ago, in which he declaimed the degree of anger directed by Northwest ranchers and farmers at EPA. And looking back on the last election, when the presidential candidate, now president, promised to break up EPA into little bits and little pieces, I wondered about the intensity of views, about the degree to which those views are widely held in rural America, And if they are in different parts in different ways, whether there's a positive response that we could have, whether there's something about the way that EPA was regulating, the way these environmental issues were framed, or the people who were framing them. And there is a good deal of information in the report that breaks up some stereotypes. I found it very interesting that there is significant level of trust in scientists on the part of rural America. Well, that belies the general wariness of the views on climate change. And yet it appears to be consistent with broader polls of the American people. One was conducted by the American Association, I think, the Advancement of Science a couple of years ago. And I think that's important to see that convergence. Also, the discussion of values makes very clear that there's no disjunction, there's no incongruity in the values that people in rural America have for the environment, for nature. In many respects, they have much more knowledge specifically of nature and of the environment, and much more direct confrontation, I know from a farm that I have in southern Illinois, with the changes in the weather and the degree to which that affects all sorts of things, which is when they plant and whether they have to plant a second time because of flooding, and how late the harvest can be. Well, I think that the reaction to government programs, although there is wariness that's signaled about government programs, there's also, I think, a judicious sense that some of them are pretty good, that rural Americans value some aspects of government programs, and they're quite aware that they need them for the environment. They have more trust in locally sourced information on the environment, whether it's from their nearby university or from local government, state government. And that's natural, I think. That's quite common and to be expected. I have myself encountered the distinction that the report discovers between those who are regarded, attitudes toward those who are regarded as conservationist and those who are regarded as environmentalist. In the Southeast, with respect to the forestry issue, I know that the people who appear regularly to protest new plants to use biomass for pellets to send to Europe to reduce their coal dependency, they are despised by the local folks. They are seen as people who are not sensitive to the job needs or to the economies, and disparaging of the values that the people in those areas bring to the whole issue of managed forest. They have a sense, however, and their relations with some groups like the Nature Conservancy are much better. Their word, by the way, for the people who show up against their proposed new expansions or plants, the negative word that they have is environmentalist, which has always bothered me a lot. The report, if it has a weakness, and I don't think that I wouldn't know how it could have been corrected, obviously, but the anger that is felt in the case where there are conflicts with respect, for example, to regulation of wetlands and the waters of the United States, that whole issue doesn't feature too significantly in the report, but in my experience, it has been a source of considerable division of opinion on the part of the people administering laws and those who are most responsible for executing on them, which typically is landowners and farmers. But by and large, the degree to which the values that are expressed by rural Americans with respect to nature and the environment, and the correspondence as they're compared with the views of people in rural areas, which are also set out here, I think is a sense, creates in me a sense that there is something we can build on here. There's a foundation of a more unified, a more sympathetic approach, more of a respect for the views of other people than exist in some parts of the country, at least with respect to some issues. And I think we can build on that. The message of the report that we need to engage, particularly to deal with the sense that people have, many in rural areas, that the elites are writing and administering these laws, and not taking their views into account in the rural area. I think that is something that agencies of the government can respond to, and I hope they'll pay close attention to this report and its conclusions and recommendations. But it's something I think that people in the environmental community, the NGO community, ought also to be sensitive to. The degree to which, I think it was Erin Fitzgerald, who was on this program later, said recently, in all of the meetings that she has, it's very rare when stakeholders are all assembled that stakeholders are defined to include a farmer. I think that's been my experience as well. In some cases, I think the efforts ought to be extended. We did this for a time at EPA to reach out to people who are not necessarily included, but who will be very significantly affected by decisions that we make. And that's a message for the federal government, that there are ways that we can make a contribution here to put the country back together, to deal with some of the passion, the animosity, antagonisms that characterize various issues, to do an important bit of service at a time when the country so desperately needs a greater sense of unity and shared purpose. So I compliment the authors of the report and compliment the Center and AU for sponsoring it. Thank you, Dan.
Great, Bill. Thank you very much. This is Robert Bonney. Glad to be with everyone today. I'm going to pull up a slide deck for my presentation. I hope everybody is safe and well and in these challenging times. Thank you, Bill, for the kind introduction. What I want to do is I want to run through some of the highlights of the report, respond to a couple of things that that Bill said, which I think were good points. I spent 8 years at USDA during the Obama administration, and before that worked at Environmental Defense Fund, and have worked my entire career with rural constituencies, and have always been cognizant of the fact that the rural folks sometimes think about these issues differently. But was frustrated when I was at USDA, there wasn't a whole lot of data, and so when I moved to Duke, began this process of looking at the urban-rural divide. This will be obvious to a lot of you, but it's important to know why rural matters. Rural voters obviously matter a great deal, but also rural, if we think about conservation, environmental issues, rural lands matter, and most of the land in the United States is privately owned, but even in areas where you have public lands, those rural communities have a big say in how those lands are managed. So rural matters there too. And we also forget that a lot of the agencies that oversee U.S. lands, whether it's USDA, Department of Interior, a lot of those agencies are made up of rural folks as well. And so understanding rural helps there. And then lastly, there's this little thing in Washington called the United States Senate, which was built in part to empower rural states. So rural matters for a lot of environmental policy. And I would argue that a lot of the resistance you've seen to expanding environmental policy, new environmental laws in Washington, D.C. has a lot to do with rural concern about those laws. So just a brief summary of what we did: worked with Hart Research Associates and Newbridge Strategy as pollsters. One of my colleagues at Duke went to University of Rhode Island, so worked with University of Rhode Island at the end of the project, and then also with University of Wyoming. We did a series of focus groups across the country, in-person, telephone, online, a national telephone poll of 1,600 voters. We did online polls of Midwest rural voters as well as Wyoming voters. And then we interviewed leaders in agriculture, forestry, local government, African-American landowners, tribes, labor across the country as part of the project as well. So when you think about the urban-rural divide, I mean, one issue that might be central to the divide is maybe rural folks just don't care about the environment as much as urban and suburban voters. And so in our focus groups, when we held focus groups, we would start off by telling the voters, hey, you all are all from rural parts of the country or rural parts of the state. What does it mean to live to be a resident of rural America? And in every single focus group, people would, without being prompted by us, start to talk about the environment, clean air, clean water, open space, wildlife. And when we asked in the poll, and you see the slide here of our poll results, there's virtually no difference between urban and rural voters on how much they care about the environment. And if you correct for party, there's virtually no difference. So the urban-rural divide isn't defined by who cares more for the environment. And anybody that's worked with rural constituencies knows there's a deep conservation ethic that cuts through so much of rural. So maybe it's not about who cares more. Maybe it's a recognition that there are trade-offs, that there are economic trade-offs that those voters see. And so we asked about that. We asked about that in focus groups, and we asked about it in the poll as well. And you see here that people actually prioritize across parties across the urban-rural divide. They prioritize environmental protection over economic growth, even when they are asked about sacrificing some economic growth for protection of the environment. So it's not about trade-offs, not about economic losses. Another thing we thought was, well, maybe there are differences in understanding about environmental issues. And we found rural voters in focus groups to be actually quite sophisticated about these issues. And so it's not a question of understanding. And as Bill alluded to, there's actually rural voters tend to be quite sophisticated. And if you talk to rural voters in Montana, they're pretty smart about wildfire, for example. If you talk to rural voters in Arizona or Nevada, they're pretty smart about water issues. Fundamental cleavage that we found in the data, both in the poll, the results you see here, but as well in focus groups, is views about the government. It happened again and again in focus groups. Start off people talking about the environment, they're very, very positive. The minute you start to talk about government oversight, while there's a recognition that regulation is important and necessary, you can feel the room in the focus group just start to tap on the brake. And here in the poll, you see the same thing. And this is not just a question of party. You see that folks in rural parts of the country, whether Democrats, Independents, or Republicans, are less likely to be comfortable with higher levels of government oversight on the environment and conservation. Even if you look at demographic groups that you would think would be more environmentally inclined, young voters, voters with postgrad education, or voters who simply say the environment's very important, you see this dampening effect. In rural parts of the country, folks are more concerned with increased government oversight around the environment and conservation. Bill talked a bit about the anger and how, you know, he saw that in his role at EPA. We didn't talk about, he's right, we didn't talk about it a whole lot in the report. I will tell you, as someone that spent time in the Obama administration, did a lot of public meetings, when we walked into the focus groups, I was really taken back by some of the cynicism and concern about the government. So he's right, it's there. So on the one hand, you have voters that very much view themselves as conservationists. They care about the environment. On the other hand, they voice these concerns about environmental laws. And this came through again and again. The quotes you see here from participants in a focus group are a couple of different focus groups out west. And what we did was we teed up the issues around waters of the US, the debate we're having about the extent of regulation, the regulatory impact of the Clean Water Act. And we, in an unbiased way, just teed up the issue and asked them for their opinions. And you'll see that voters tended to be very strongly in favor of clean water, but they had concerns about the ability of the government to do this in a fair way and to do it in a way that took into account rural interests. The other point I'd make, I made the point earlier about sophistication of these voters. These are just two random rural voters, right? But very sophisticated responses to the question. So it's entirely consistent for these voters to view themselves as pro-environment, but at the same time be very concerned about federal environmental laws. We were interested in all the interviews and focus groups and polling we did about who rural voters trust, and we asked them. We give them a list of different folks, and you'll see farmers and ranchers. If you add in forest landowners, you'll get the same response. Always scored to the top, and the same was generally true in focus groups as well. As Bill pointed out, scientists very high The interesting thing here is that we found that rural voters didn't know where to access a lot of that science. So there's a gap. There was a value there, but there was a sense that they didn't know where to find that information. Also note that government agencies actually score pretty high, and that seems to contradict what I just argued to you about concern about the government. But again, we think those voters are being fairly sophisticated about government scientists, or in the case of, I think, a lot of rural voters, maybe they know or have familiarity with their local Forest Service office, or their local BLM or Fish and Wildlife Service or USDA office. While it's not a sign that they're not trusted, you see conservation groups and environmental groups score low, and this was true in focus groups as well. So I want to turn to a little bit towards climate. We asked, we always save climate to the end of the conversation, both in focus groups and polling, because it's a very highly polarizing issue in and of itself. And before we talked about climate change in the poll, we actually asked this question: have you experienced weather changes such as increased hurricanes, flooding, droughts, higher temperatures, or wildfires in your community? You see here the answers are actually polarized. They're polarized across the urban-rural divide, and they're polarized across party. And I think folks have gotten smart that they a little bit know what you're asking here. And this is a question about climate change. And I think that's part of the reason you get the polarization here when you ask just about the weather without reference to climate. We asked in the poll how important it was the United States to take action on reducing climate change. Here you see about a 15-point spread between rural voters and suburban and urban voters. On the one hand, you might look at this and say, well, 54%, that's actually pretty good. But this is before you actually start to tap into some of those concerns about government oversight and government regulation. And so I would say 54% your high water mark. If you start talking about certain types of ways to deal with climate change, you might find that drop a bit. We found that views on the government are a very good predictor of people's views on whether or not to take action on climate change. And the same thing came out in the focus groups. Here you have a farmer basically saying, yes, look, we've seen that climate change is happening. We're actually hesitant to say it because we're afraid of the policy consequences. So this tie between attitudes on the government versus attitudes on climate action, I think, is real. I suspect it's beyond rural. So just a few implications, and then I'll turn it back. This is not a simple fix. This is not something that we get better messaging points that if we learn how to talk a little bit better to rural, that we're going to be able to bridge this divide. It's going to take engagement. Bill talked about this, engaging with rural communities. There's a sense that they don't feel they've been listened to, but there's also a reason to be optimistic. And then particularly with the stakeholder leaders, there was a real interest in engaging, in talking to constituents on this and dealing with both government agencies, conservation groups, and others. It's going to take some rethinking policy as well. My view is that there's a prism that a lot of people in rural look through when they think about environmental policy these days. They may have a direct experience with policy, or they may have heard things about policy, and that prism colors the way they think about climate change or other issues. And so a conversation with rural about how to design policies in ways that work, I think, is important. And I would just end by saying there are lots of reasons for optimism. Again, there's a strong conservation ethic. There's an interest in engaging, but it's gonna take those of us who care about these issues to engage with rural stakeholders and rural voters in a different way. Let me stop there and just say the report is, go to the Nicholas Institute website if you want more on the report. We'll have more out. We're gonna do a report specifically on climate change in the coming weeks, and really appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you today.
Great, thank you, Robert. Before moving on, I did have a question on from the audience on whether these slides would be available, and they will. And we're recording this program, and it will be available on the Center for Environmental Policy website. So a few reactions. I would start with Erin from the Farmers and Ranchers Alliance.
Well, thank you, Bill, and Robert at Duke University for even taking on this study. I know when he gave me a call that this study had happened, it was definitely music to my ears. And thank you, Dan, for putting me on the panel today. So I can't specifically speak about policy. At U.S. Farmers and Ranchers, we are a collective of many different farmer groups and working on this topic. But what I can say is that the data, I think, Robert, when you first called me, you said, is this surprising? And what's interesting is this data really does track a lot with the consumer data we've been seeing quite a bit as many Americans search for really understanding where their food comes from and really have a more connection to understanding what's farmers' role in the topic of the environment and sustainability. And for me, the biggest takeaway from the report that I really loved in the conclusion was engage with farmers directly. I was pleased to see that farmers tended to be the source, the trusted source for the environment and conservation. And to me, that was really no surprise. I grew up in rural America too, and it's where you pass on the highway, those green spaces. You probably went on a canoe trip, or somebody, and so you really do connect to the birds or things that you see that are connected with nature, and you connect that with farming. So I think in rural America, it makes sense that they're connecting with the farmer when it comes to these topics. And then also, just in general, farmers, when it comes to a source of trust, does rank high. If you look at a lot of the trust barometers, you'd have a fireman, a policeman, maybe a little lower, a wounded veteran, and farmers really are right up there in that high trust category in terms of people that we trust. The other thing I loved in the report was lead with science. And what an interesting time to be talking about leading with science, right? But when I think about science in general on the three topics we're talking about, sustainability, I always say it's super complex. Might as well say it's one of the hardest things to talk about. And then agriculture is really complex. It's this biological thing we create with Mother Nature. It's an art and a science at the same time. It's hyper precise. Unless you get on a farm and really see it, it's hard to understand what's really going on there. And then you're talking about another science, which is climate change. So we have three culture change educations, if you will, or awareness around different aspects of science that are kind of leading into this conversation. It makes it a challenge for all of us, really, I think, to engage meaningfully on these topics because the science is complicated, or let's say complex. And then the other point in the report that I love that you made, Robert, was that messages matter. We often say in the work that we do that words do create worlds, and I would say the people behind these words and what they mean and what their values are really matter. And so on the one hand, I'll be in conversations, and you'll hear this conversation that the food system is broken, our agriculture is broken. We need a whole system change. And you can imagine the people that when they hear that, what they feel when we use those words like that. I mean, it's definitely immediately alarming, right? Especially if you're part of that and there's a sense of place and pride for generations, and someone's telling you that everything you've done is broken, it doesn't play well. And then just being included in the conversation, as we talked about, is critical. I'm in so many conferences where, in conference rooms where I'm like, oh, it's 70 degrees and fluorescent in this conference room, and we're talking about what needs to be happening on a farm. We do have to get our boots dirty in these conversations and really engage with the people that are having this conversation. And I work with farmers, so I will tell you that the values are there, and that's what gets me really excited in thinking about people-based change. If that's really our conversation about what we truly want, is how do we get groups of people to really care about this topic. I get very excited when I think about the farming sector as a people-based group of individuals that, number one, care about stewardship. It's innate in their values. They will use the language, I want to leave the land better for the next generation. That is right in their ethos. And then, so sustainability then is about putting those values to work day in and day out. Sustainability includes making the economic business models line up for your community and the planet. And I think the sustainability conversation is very different than the conservation conversation, because the conservation conversation is saying, I want you to do environmental things, But sustainability is saying, oh, we got to do the hard work about making the business case, getting it to line up so that it works for that business, it works for that community, it works for the planet. You know, it's that constant Venn diagram that we always show. And so I do think those values are there, but the business model is a really, really tough business model, this business of farming. And we've got a lot of work to do on that. And then I got excited in the report where you talk about being part of the solution. Sure, there is definitely substantial skepticism, but I think for this sector, compared to any other sector, based on the people values, the people-based movement, and then just the land aspect, you know, 48% of the land mass is in the hands of 2 million farmers who have this values of stewardship. And then you also think about the very nature of what agriculture is doing. You know, we're 9% of the carbon equation, but that carbon equation is a biogenic carbon. So it can have this potential to cycle carbon. And there's currently 100 times more carbon that's being stored in our soils than's currently emitted. So that's kind of our bank, right? But then if you imagine for the future, like, okay, if this group in this sector is really kind of called to action and included into this conversation, what might be the potential? And, you know, then you look at the National Academy of Science report and you see, well, gosh, its potential given agriculture's current trajectory of their improvement. They've already reduced their carbon footprint. They're likely on a pathway to have their carbon footprint in the next decade and could maybe be a net negative carbon emitter. And if that's the case, that would make this sector uniquely not just reducing a footprint, but also having that handprint in society that, you know, inspires rural vibrancy, hits that community rural impact really hard, and is a sector that can enable a net zero economy. So I think really understanding agriculture's unique role as a people-based on that landmass, and its unique ability to solve for the sustainability question we're asking is what I got very excited in reading the report, and just super excited to kind of explore all the different topics we were thinking about today.
Thank you, Erin. We'll be returning to some of those themes later. Brent Fewell from ConservAmerica. Brent?
Well, thank you, Dan. And I want to thank Dan and his team for pulling this discussion together so quickly. And also want to commend Robert Bonney and Nicholas Institute for commissioning the study. And, you know, I want to share some perspectives, personal perspectives, but also those of my experience through my colleagues, with my colleagues at ConservAmerica. And I think this is an incredibly important discussion. And I'm hopeful that it marks the beginning of a more meaningful dialogue that leads to breaking down many of the barriers to some of the policy solutions that many of us care about. And I'd also note that while the study offers great insight to the rural-urban divide, you know, I would also note that there are many parallels to the conservative-liberal divide that we see in this country. And those are some of the barriers that I and my colleagues at ConservAmerica continue to try to remove. But you know, one thing that I would say is there's one word in the title of Robert's study that I think is just incredibly powerful, and that's the act of understanding. The title, Understanding Rural Attitudes. And I think the very act, Dan, of taking the time to listen and understand those with whom we may disagree, I believe is just an important step to solving many of our environmental challenges. As many who know me know, when I'm not in Washington, D.C., I'm at my family place in Brooklyn, Maine, where I'm joining everyone from now today. It's a small rural coastal town whose economy is based on fishing and boat building, and this is my place to reground and enjoy nature's incredible beauty. The residents of Brooklyn make their livelihood off the land, and the concept of stewardship of the natural resources is not only a way of life for them here, but they view stewardship as a moral obligation. And in that respect, Brooklyn, Maine is a microcosm of rural and small town America all across the country. There's a wonderful tradition here in Brooklyn where the locals get together in the morning for coffee and share the latest gossip and news. And it's an early crowd that gather between 5 and 7 in the morning before heading off to work. You know, everyone from lobstermen to boat builders to plumbers and mechanics and and others that really keep the economy live in a small town. And until they met me, they had never met or spoken with anyone from EPA before. So as you can imagine, we have had some very spirited discussions over the years about the importance of the mission, the agency and its mission. Some, would prefer to see the agency go away. We heard, Bill and Robert talk about government overreach, and that's clearly on their mind. But I've learned a number of important things from my relationships and friendships with many of the locals here. Although they are highly mistrustful of government action, they are willing to make and accept those hard policy decisions, even those that directly impact their way of life. I think another important lesson is people don't like to be told what to do. So collaboration is better than coercion. And we've heard it from the other panelists. People want to be heard. Rural Americans want to be heard, and they want Washington, D.C. and state officials to know that even the smallest regulations can have a big impact on the way of life in these small towns. And they often feel that decisions impacting their lives are made without any input or regard for economic impacts. We've heard about some of the regulations that have been really tough, where there's been a lot of antagonism and animosity. Waters of the US and the regulation of wetlands and small tributaries and ditches, concentrated animal feeding operations, air toxics, and even impacting the boat building industry here in rural America. Last thing I would say is trust and credibility matter. People in general, not just rural or urban communities or Republican or Democrats, all people are willing to accept the decisions of public officials if they trust the decision maker and understand the science underlying those decisions. And I think that's been one of the biggest problems in climate, and the topic of polarized topic of climate is such a complex issue with so much uncertainty that people simply do not know what to believe, and so they gravitate to those who they trust. And whether it's Al Gore, who says, who basically claims it's an existential threat, or Rush Limbaugh, who says it's all a hoax. So we have to do a better job of communicating and reaching out to those people who may not have access to scientists and have the best information. And also on the topic of, while we're on the topic of climate, one idea that I'd share with you, a few months ago, I was asked to participate in a half-day event to help craft a message that would resonate with conservatives and independent voters. I'm not minimizing the importance of messaging, because it is absolutely critical, but what I was dumbstruck by was a room full of mostly progressives or single issue conservatives trying to fine tune and create the perfect message. As Bill said earlier in the program, it's more than just messaging. A couple of days after the meeting, I was contacted by one of the organizers who asked my opinion. And as I told my friend, if you really want to know why some seemingly smart people are still skeptical about human climate change and climate solutions, why don't you ask them? Many of them care deeply about the environment, but there's been very little outreach to those individuals who have legitimate questions about the uncertainties, and who with additional engagement and thoughtful interaction, we may be able to bring around to accepting the fact that climate change is something that we need to take seriously. So in closing, I'm extremely optimistic, as the other panelists are, on this topic. And as Robert has suggested in his paper, I would encourage everyone to read it if you haven't. We need to rethink the design of environmental strategies to include more thoughtful engagement. And a couple of specific things: we need to do a better job at listening and understanding the position of those with whom we may disagree. Stereotypes, as we see from Robert's paper, are often wrong and seldom rooted in reality. And lastly, we need to seek out and work with those champions and leaders like Erin Fitzgerald, who have credibility and standing within their community and social spheres. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Brent. So we're going to talk about a few issues, and then we'll take audience questions, which are building up. I do want to mention that we will send around to everybody who registered the link to the Center for Environmental Policy website, where you'll have access to this program later, and also the link to the Nicholas Institute and Robert's report. So we'll get that information out to folks. So the word trust came up a couple of times. I know Brent mentioned it, and I think a few others did. And trust in government is an issue. If we look back over the last half century, that hasn't been an area of great success in the United States, and I think it comes up in this context. So I'm wondering, is this a cultural thing? Is it about not really trusting people to make the right kinds of decisions? Just wondered, get some reflections on what the issue is here, and maybe how to start overcoming it. So maybe start with Bill. And
okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think that the conversation we've just been having, and particularly listening to the other panelists, it strikes me as someone who works with a very sophisticated farmer and his friends who were extremely adept business people. I mean, who plays the commodities market? The farmers do. I wouldn't. They're very smart people. My question, I have asked him several times about regenerative farming and the various innovations that we read about from time to time. He's never had, and he's a graduate of the agricultural school at UL Illinois, and yet he has not had a direct engagement, when we talk about engagement, with anybody who understands it on his level. That is, on whether if you engage in that, you have a higher return, whether it works for you financially, or if it doesn't, it will over a course of 2 or 3 years of cultivating the soils and improving them and all the rest. So my question is really for Erin, how can we improve the instruments of engagement? Which instruments are routinely available to a farmer if they show any interest in it? Is there a research service or conservation service of the agriculture department? Is that well enough staffed to respond to people who have a serious interest in it? And I think that I think such people, to the extent they understand farming, could be very helpful in bridging some of these gaps.
Yeah, I think, this is the real question, right? So one, often I get into conversations about what practices farmers should be doing on their farm. And I always just encourage people to substitute the word farmer for chef. So you would never go into a chef and say to a chef in a restaurant and be like, how are you cooking your steak? You should just be broiling it. There's clearly like all these different techniques of practices that they do, sous vide, broiling, grilling, all of that. And then you judge the outcome of the steak. Same thing in agriculture. There's a level of hyper precision that's happening on these farms. Practices are different types of techniques or recipes, but we need to make certain that the farmer, we enable all those different techniques for those recipes. And the first thing a farmer will say is, I need to know that this technique is going to pay off. So yes. Increasingly, as you are seeing our farmers really are living a risk-saturated business model. It's tough times, tough P&Ls. As you mentioned, many of the farmers I work with, they're doing quant math in their head on futures and forwards and, their calculations of NPK. They really do understand this, but it's really that, how is this practice? How, if I do this, is it going to enable the risk for this next season? And I talk a lot about risk because, if you look at each harvest season, when our farmers are going out, it's a big bet. They are betting their entire farms on that. So it's not and they're betting that they're typically not just planning for this one season. They're planning, 3, 4, 5, 6, sometimes decades forward in their decision making. And it's not as easy of a question as, oh, just change practice, or, oh, just change what you're growing. So we need to understand the risk and economic trade-offs of many of these conversations. And often, if you look at the current balance sheets, things are not going well. It is tough times out there. And so, asking for change without the economic aspects included is a really tough conversation. And so, you know, as simple as it might sound, just even changing the word from a farmer to a chef is like really kind of like, of course, I would never walk into a restaurant and tell a chef to change that, you know, without discussing all this, you know. And I think sometimes when we think about farmers, we might oversimplify just how complex that business model is.
Okay, Brent or Robert, would you like to jump into that?
Dan, just a thought. This is Brent. You know, I would agree with Erin that the public in rural America wants to know that the sacrifices they are being asked to make for are good, not only for the public good, but they're going to be good for them as well. And case in point here in Maine, obviously climate change is warmer as waters become warmer. There's a real risk to the lobstering industry as lobsters move farther north to cooler waters. So you know, unless we act, and it's going to have a direct economic impact on a lot of these communities. So I think the more we can relate the regulations and the sacrifices directly to those that are being impacted and explain to them, better explain to them how it is beneficial to them, you know, it's going to be hard to make progress.
Yeah, this is Robert. I would just add, you know, we did a focus group in the upper Midwest with some rural voters, and we asked about climate change, and you could feel the tension within the room. But everybody was united in the fact that they were concerned about the extremes on both sides. There were extremes about one side saying this is you know, this is an enormous catastrophe, and on the other side, the hoax. And you could see the voters a little bit struggling with who to trust, what's good information, and they wanted a, you know, kind of a science-based, reasonable dialogue about the topic, but they didn't exactly know kind of where to get it. But there was this sense that a lot of times when we bring up climate change in a focus group, people a little bit want to duck and cover because it feels very polarizing, and you can feel that when you talk to rural folks about it.
Yeah, yeah. Another point I'd like to get into before we take audience questions. So Erin, you talked about leading with science, which is certainly a good principle. Has science lost some of its status in these kinds of debates? I mean, are people still sort of recognizing that? Is it who's talking about the science or where the scientists are coming from? Could you maybe talk a bit about that, then we can get a few reactions from the others?
Well, I mean, I think in general, you know, some things I talk to farmers a lot about is that we kind of tend to all pick and choose our the science that we like. You know, particularly in the conservation and environmental and farming, the biggest thing would be GMOs, right? Like there's one camp of people who believe that we need GMOs in the face of climate change, but then there's another camp that doesn't. And then there's a camp that believes in climate change, and then there's another camp that doesn't believe in climate change. And I would argue that those are actually reverse, sometimes flipped conversations. And so it's really not kind of an either or, right? We're going to need both. So there's a little bit of just in general polarizing conversations related to science. I personally think, you know, we know a lot of science, and well, we're getting smarter, let's say, on soil science, adaptation, resiliency of crops. You know, that really gets to the heart of what a farmer is going to need and to be able to do each growing season. So the more we can understand soil science, productivity, you know, the ability for our crops and our animals to weather the storm, so to speak, that's what a farmer looks at in their business model, and that is being climate smart agriculture, right? And so it's a twofer. We're not necessarily using the words, but climate smart agriculture is really about making certain that we're looking at productivity of that farm, the outcome related to soil health, the outcome related to carbon improvement, the outcome related to water improvement and biodiversity. But it's an and, it's not an either or. And so those are trade-offs. And I think many times, you know, in talking with farmers, they get kind of frustrated that they're being critiqued for the trade-offs. Every business makes a trade-off. And so the question is, how do you make the business models and the science sync up that you can easily see those trade-offs that you're making. Some might be short-term decisions, some might be more longer-term decisions. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done in translating that climate smart agriculture. I know USDA has climate hubs that are going on. There's a lot of work trying to get the metrics for continuous improvement so that we can make certain that the variables that farmers are managing, you can see the economic and environmental trade-offs. But you gotta remember, carbon modeling, even just in agriculture, and Robert will remember, we worked a lot on this. I mean, we're kind of only 10 years into this. You know, we do know where the carbon is, but being able to link it to agriculture and understand it, you know, just even recently we're understanding, oh yeah, we're going back to our, you know, fourth through eighth grade science and realizing, yes, this carbon is making a biogenic loop. It is cycling. There's something else happening below the soil. So we need to accelerate, I think, the amount of research that's happening, connecting agriculture's role in climate, and then making sure it's specific to farmer agronomic capabilities.
Okay, thanks. Bill, from when you were administrator of EPA till now, is sort of the respect for science or the way we involve scientific issues in these decisions, has it changed, and how do we deal with that? And unmute.
Sense that that scientists are a part of the elite, and in some circles, resistance to them for that reason. I was in Germany twice in the last year and astonished. In Germany, which has always had a profound respect, reverence for scientists, they, according to several scientists that I spoke with, are losing that. And it's because of this elitist question, the question of basically is a populist feeling against those who purport to know more or to be the authorities. I think that's kind of a generalization that one can make, and you hear people sometimes talk that way. However, when I watched Dr. Fauci and the extreme acceptance, the tremendous confidence the public appears to have in him, and others who are now opining on the coronavirus, it strikes me that in specific instances, it's still there. Respect for training, for care, for objectivity, for authority. So I'm not sure how serious it is, and I took from this report encouragement on that score rather than discouragement, that actually there is respect for science. And one has to remember too that when I look at the science that goes into grain farming in the state of Illinois, into all of the decisions that are made with respect to nutrients and adequacy of nutrients and soil characteristics and weather and timing and seeds, the kinds of seeds that are being planted, there's an enormous respect, obviously, for expertise. The farmers themselves have it, actually, but they're also in touch with those sources of information that further it. So I'm not so concerned about that part of it. It's almost dependent on how the science question is phrased. In this case, I think it may be to some degree a messaging issue, although the rest of the report suggests not so much. And on the climate issue, what I took from the report is a sense that there is an underlying acknowledgement of the truth of climate change. The anxiety has to do with the response that people fear it may warrant and that elites may foist on them. That's my sense of this the way this divides up.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to add, Robert, based on your report?
I'll add one anecdote. We did some work with the University of Wyoming in Wyoming, particularly focused on migration corridors and protecting migration corridors for elk and mule deer and some of the big game there, the big ungulates there in Wyoming. And in the focus group, we had the person leading the focus group say to the group that, hey, you know, scientists say that if we lose these migration corridors, that it may take 100 years for those animals to find a way back. And the reaction of everybody in the focus group was, oh, come on, no way. They immediately sort of denied it. I don't think it was a rejection of science. I think it was a rejection of the messenger. I think the messenger matters on a lot of these things. And I think if we'd have had a wildlife biologist from the state of Wyoming come in there and talk about it, that would have been different. And I think rural folks a little bit, my same point about the climate stuff earlier, a little bit don't know where to go. And so I think messengers are really, really important in how we think about delivering information on science and a host of other things.
Okay, Brent, did you have any remarks on that before we move to some,
Dan,
questions?
I did. Yeah, just a quick thought. I think the respect for science generally has not changed, but I would absolutely agree with Robert that it's the messenger. I've been increasingly concerned about climate scientists and other scientists becoming, losing the objectivity, scientific objectivity, and moving more into policy advocates. Mm-hmm. And I think that is where scientists really risk losing credibility. I talk to a lot of my conservative colleagues who are skeptical still about climate science, not just the solution, but climate and the human impacts. And ask them, what scientists do you listen to? And they gravitate obviously to the scientists that they trust. But I do think that, geez, it's been disconcerting to me that we do seem, and the public seems to believe, that science has been politicized on some of these issues, and we've got to figure out how to get back to that objective science.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think science is an important part of the picture. So we have lots of questions from the audience, which is terrific. We won't get to all your questions, but we will get to some of them. So one question for Duncan Krim: what exactly about rural voters needs to be fixed? Being anti-government is not a moral wrong. It seems like this conversation is being framed as if it is. So there's an interesting one. Robert, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, no, I don't. We tried as much as we could to listen and not be judgmental about different attitudes. Anti-government, concern about government just is what it is. For folks that care about environmental policy, it's important to understand that, and important to understand, are there things that we could do to develop policies in different ways that actually would work for rural? So we asked, and you'll see in the report, we asked about federal versus state, much more comfortable with state government. True not only of rural voters, but true of urban voters as well. Right? And so, okay, that's interesting. And in conversations with leaders, concern about the government, but also interest in engaging in certain ways and in more collaborative ways. Okay, well, that's an interesting thing to think about as well as you design policy. And so, again, it's not to cast judgment on government one way or the other. It's to say, let's try to meet rural where they are, and let's figure out how to understand that so we can do a better job of engaging them and create policy solutions that work for the environment, but also work for rural.
That actually, mentioning state versus federal, the next question from Tom Hester: the WOTUS, the Waters of the United States rule, was a federal government-driven issue. Did you get any sense if the anti-regulatory sentiment would have been different if regulations were driven from the state level? And maybe I'd be interested to hear from Brent and Bill on this. Brent, what do you think? You used to have a high post in the water office.
Yeah, Dan, it's a great question, and no doubt the Waters of the U.S. regulation was extremely polarizing. I do believe that the public, much of the public, has a stronger trust in state and local governments to manage and balance the economic and environmental impacts associated with developing wetlands. But that's part of the problem as well. Environmentalists and NGOs do not trust always government, that there's those pressures, local pressures for construction and building that will overlook the environmental impacts and also those impacts across jurisdictional lines. So as we know, water is connected, and activities in one area can have substantial impacts on water quality downstream and across the state jurisdictions. But yes, I do believe that the public probably would have responded better had the waters of the U.S. Regulation been handled more by state government.
Okay, anybody else want to add to that?
I would just add something. I think that waters of the United States, in the way it has been administered, has a particular problem with being understood and appreciated. You have people who own land which is only irregularly wet, say in the spring, and much of the rest of the year looks like all the rest of the property. And so it's not obvious very often to people who own that land why an agency should try to regulate their behavior in that area for such a small period of the year, and why that matters, why that's important. It's a particularly hard thing to communicate, and I suspect that whether it's staffing or government resources, whatever it may be, it hasn't been effectively communicated.
We have a question now from someone several of us know, Lawana Wilcher. How might EPA's use of the precautionary principle, aka worst case analysis, which occasionally leads to overestimation of the risks, recovery time for ecosystems, and so on, how can that play into people's negative perceptions of the science? So maybe Robert, what do you think about that one?
Wow, it's a great question, and I think my answer would be as much about in what context we deliver those types of messages, in what kind of communication we have with rural communities about those types of issues, because I think if it feels like it comes from on high, and there hasn't been interaction with those stakeholders, that just no matter how good the science is, that there's a rejection of a sense that far off government kind of knows better than we do. And so to me, it's as much about like the relationship, engagement, working with people, integrating them in so they can understand the science, see it, having a conversation. I think that's as important as anything.
Could I take it for a minute?
Go ahead, Bill. Yeah, and then Erin.
I've got to say, Lawana won't like this, but I've always thought that the precautionary principle is much more acceptable and understood in Europe than it is in the United States. I mean, the environmentalists obviously are very focused on risk reduction and taking precautions. You know, we wouldn't have gone to the moon if the precautionary principle had been applied to that decision. We're a different culture. We do take more risks. We're more individualistic. So I'm just a little bit wary of applying it too consistently to decisions of this sort. Maybe let Lawana reply.
Bill, I think that honestly, you've really summed up. I mean, for me, it's like a cultural thing that's like asking, rather than asking the individual, how might you reduce risk and what's the business model? It tends to encourage a stick-based approach versus a carrot and a business innovation. And so if you just think about the size and the magnitude of the change we're trying to see, government is just one part of the solution. We need technology, we need new finance, we need new business models, we need collaboration, different value chain models. So just to assume that, a stick-based approach might be the only solution, you have to think about the whole factor of all the, classic disruptions that can happen in a sector. And if we think about it as a portfolio of how do we make a business model that could work, how do we enable the innovation and the science in this space, how do we enable the culture change, the people base, the social change in this space, as opposed to just the risk-based and the policy-based approach, that might lead to our shared outcomes that, I think many of us want. but we tend to always take a policy-based approach as opposed to think of the whole portfolio of solutions.
And that actually leads into an interesting question for you, Erin. I would like to hear more. This is from John Reeder from American University. Would like to hear more about Erin's vision on how farmers can gain financially in the future for carbon removal.
Yeah, I mean, arguably, I think in general, you know, we've been saying that the last 2 harvest seasons were probably the worst in a generation. This is a business model that is increasingly is risk saturated. It is not, we see the farmers are receiving about 8 cents per dollar of a consumer dollar in the share. You're seeing increased balance sheet issues. That is not what I would call a sustainable business model, flat out. And then we're asking for all of these other benefits to society and nature and our environment. So we definitely have to have a way to start to monetize the other product that our farmers are providing beyond just food, fuel, and fiber. They provide for flyways, they're providing for green spaces, they're providing for carbon cycling, water. You know, if I take many of my farmers in upstate New York, Brent, I need to get up to Maine sometime. But, you know, they are connected to the city of New York's watershed. So therein lies a potential to have an urban-rural intersect just on water bonding, right? Creating green bonds for the community infrastructure of New York City. We need to think about these different types of business models for the ecosystem services. We've talked a long time about cap and trade, carbon trading, and nutrient trading, but really, we can start thinking creatively about these business models from philanthropic, right? So are we investing in farming as a solution to climate change, to angel, to venture? Do we have the right innovation pipeline to meet that climate smart challenge of agriculture, to traditional and risk-based finance models that can ultimately stack and help that farmer? You know, just think about renewable energy, right? Where is the likelihood of the most renewable energy going to be? It's going to be on American farmland. You know, if I think about many of these carbon, these CEOs that are making carbon forest declaration for afforestation, where do you think it's likely going to be put, these trees? On farmland. You know, and so, you know, if you're in the food sector and you have supply chain sourcing goals and have a carbon policy, why wouldn't you buy renewable energy credits from the farm community? Because now you're reinforcing, right, your supply chain in a different way where that economic can stack. So we need to think of traditional forms of financing to help get that farmer have different forms of revenue that is coming in to pay for eco performance. If that's what we want, it goes well beyond policy. It comes to really creative new business models. We've seen this happen in the renewable energy sector. We know that these different types of finance structures can work. Right now, we don't have that necessarily in the farming community. We're just about ready to kick off a grant to kind of go look at all these different forms of trying to inject different forms of creative capital in the finance sector. And in general, we're seeing a flight of capital in the sector. You know, that's not a good thing. You know, if our farmers are going through tough times, it only exacerbates the problem in rural America, and it only exacerbates, you know, the intended benefits people want to see in environmental outcomes. So we have got to make certain, first and foremost, that our farms are profitable farms. If that is a sustainable business model, all the rest will go into place.
Thank you. Yeah, sort of the key, I think, is aligning business success with environmental objectives. And I think there are opportunities to do that, and we're missing some. So here's, actually, this is a very important question. So we'll start with Robert and Brent on this. This is from Garrett Grady Lovelace from American University. I hope the panelists can discuss the racial diversity in rural America. That gets overlooked. Indigenous, African-American, immigrant, Latinx farmers, ranchers, farm workers, and residents make up a crucial part of rural America. How are they involved in these studies on environmental attitudes? So maybe Robert and then Brent.
Yeah, so this is a really important point. And we, in our leader interviews, really reached out to African-American landowners in the South, tribal representatives in a couple of different places, 3 different tribal representatives across the country. You're absolutely right. There's enormous diversity in rural America, and it varies. Hispanic communities in the Southwest, this is an area where I actually think there's more work that could be done. I think we've done a pretty good job of delving into this subject, but I think there's more diversity. One of the other areas I think is really interesting is religious communities in rural, what role religion plays in all this. And so that diversity is really, really important. We tried to capture it as best we could, but I do think there's more work to be done there, and it's an area that I've encouraged folks to look into in the wake of our study.
Did you want to add anything, Brent?
Dan, I think Robert did a great job on that question. I did want to just back up for a second on the last John Reeder's question in what Erin alluded to. I think there is a real opportunity to work with farmers in the agricultural community to commoditize a lot of the ecosystem services, and we're trying to do that. It's sometimes very tough to do. We at ConservAmerica obviously promote market-based approaches to environmental outcomes, and I've spent my many years focusing on water quality trading and using and working between urban and rural users of that water. So I think there's enormous opportunity to help agricultural community at a time when another source of revenue is available.
Okay, here's a good political science question. It was responding to something Brent said that I can ask generally. I support the notion of listening better, but how as a practical matter can government do that with millions of people? So it's really, I think, getting at how do you listen? How do you engage? What mechanisms or platforms might you want to use? So anybody that would like to start with that one.
Yeah, I mean, this is Robert. We when I was in the Obama administration, we wrote the rule that governs management of all the national forests. It's called the planning rule. It's how forests you write a plan for each national forest. We built collaboration into the rulemaking. We started out with a notice to propose rulemaking. We did a series of public events across the country. We then did the same thing when we had a draft rule. Then when we had a final rule, we actually did more meetings on the back end about implementation. So there are ways to build this in. I would just say, sort of more broadly, I'm not suggesting that the collaboration is going to work for everything. Yeah. There are places where good old command and control or regulation is necessary, has to be a tool that is utilized. It just can't be the only tool. And even when we use it, we've got to figure out how to use it in a way that brings people along to the extent we can. We're not going to solve all these problems by sitting in a big circle and singing Kumbaya. And I'm not suggesting that at all. But I am suggesting that we actually need to take a step back and realize that is not the only thing, that there's a whole lot of innovation that you've heard from Erin, you've heard from Brent about markets and those types of things. And then we need to broaden the conversation and bring rural in. And then when we do have to resort to, a more regulatory approach, we've actually built some trust and we've got relationships where maybe that stuff actually gets a little easier.
Mm-hmm.
I comment on that.
Go ahead, Bill.
I was part yesterday of a public hearing held by the Union of Concerned Scientists on the new regulation on science and science protocols that EPA has put out. They put that regulation out. They had 600,000 comments over a couple of months. They added another month, but they are inexplicably and very much contrary to tradition, not holding a public hearing themselves. And that's why the Union of Concerned Scientists elected to do it. In other words, it's going directly the wrong direction. In the government. And that is a consultation mechanism that connected people, informed people use if they know about it. So that's worth noting, that is of concern. The second thing I would say is that I think that the communities at large need to take a larger role in making themselves heard by the members of Congress. I'm struck by the number of times I have spoken to Republican members of Congress who themselves personally are quite sympathetic to doing more with respect to climate, but who say to me, look, these issues don't come up when I'm in my district, when I have town meetings, things of that sort. The environment rarely comes up, and the climate almost never comes up. And I know that students, I've worked with some at AU and other places, are often looking for ways to be effective on some of the issues of concern to them. And so they protest against fossil fuel investments by the universities, fine. But they don't go to the district from which they come and make themselves heard, because I can just tell you, having been around a while, that if the questions are raised by constituents in a constituent forum, the congressperson informs himself or herself next time to be better able to answer it and to respond, well, what are you doing about it? And without raising the question, and they don't hear it, it doesn't strike people as worthy of concern. So that's a message for farmers, for, I think, for their children, for all of us, that to be heard on these. We do have fundamentally a democratic system, and that's one place where it's communicated.
Great, thanks. So here's a question from S. Weeks. How do you balance, this really gets, and I know in the report, Robert, you had some discussion of sort of perceptions of conservation versus preservation. So this partly gets into that. How do you balance the stewardship and preservation of the land with economic activities that require exploiting the land? Like with the issue of ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, drilling oil versus preserving the land, which is required for the livelihoods of local tribes. So it's this preservation and stewardship versus economic activities to do things on land. So maybe Robert and Brent could comment on that.
Yeah, again, I would a little bit echo what I said before. There are going to be places where, whether it's ANWR, or I did a lot of work on the Tongass National Forest. It's a spectacular resource. There are rural communities there that are dependent on some forestry jobs, and balancing those things, you have to make decisions about that. I think there are a lot of folks in rural that operate under the sense that, all issues are sort of painted in that, or they tend to see the issues in very polarized, or painted in those sort of polarized ways. And again, I think there are absolutely places where there are real trade-offs, and we have to make decisions. But I also think there are places where we can actually bring rural constituents along and engage them. And so, it's sort of echoing my earlier comments, that I just think, if you look at the debate around climate change, for example, the rural folks are anticipating that it's going to be polarized, anticipating that the question on the weather, they're reading into what the question is. And the question is, for all of us, I think, is, can we step away from that and engage rural in a way that we sort of get beyond that sense that everything's got to be black or white?
Dan, I think Robert's absolutely right. There has to be a balance here. And I'd kind of shift the attention away from climate to endangered species. And while the Endangered Species Act has done important things to protect species, it's also been extremely costly, and many of us would argue maybe not as effective as it could be if we were to think outside the box. 70% of threatened and endangered species, distressed species, are on private property. We need to figure out a way to turn endangered species from liabilities into assets, and encourage landowners to actually actively promote the creation of critical habitats. It's something this administration is trying to do. Obviously, it's very controversial. Some believe that the federal government is the best answer to protecting those species. but there's not enough species cops out there to monitor this. And what I would also say is the Endangered Species Act, in many cases, has had adverse consequences. The old shoot, shovel, and shut up, where people actually will manage their land to actually eliminate the presence of potential critical habitat to a species. We don't want to do that. So I think there is a way of balancing our goal of environmental protection, species protection, with also those economic interests.
Erin.
Yeah, I really love this question because I think it's at the heart of what is sustainability. Yeah. You know, when the Sustainable Development Goals were launched, they put goal number 2, food and ag, right up at the top. And goal number 1 was economic development, the ability to lift people out and prosperity, right? In particular, you see that in rural America, and you see it all across the world, because the only number 1 proven way to do that and do that well, lift people out and unlock all 17 goals, is through food and ag. And so it is critical that we have a prosperous food and ag sector. So this idea of having economic activity in agricultural lands is so connected to conservation and climate change, and arguably rural America and society as that handprint for nutrition. But just on a conservation and environmental perspective alone, you know, when agriculture becomes productive, it allows for less land, right, to be able to be used. And so you've seen conservation now, you know, is at 15% of farmlands have conservation, about the equivalent of California and New York combined. You know, but if those ag lands are marginalized and they're not, those farms are no longer profitable, you know, according to American Farmland Trust, we're losing 175 acres of farmland. Well, now that's a cemented pavement strip mall, right? So it exasperates that carbon sink that we're looking for. And so we need to make certain that our farmlands are absolutely able to provide for green things, right? And be able to be that carbon sink and that carbon cycler, which provides for conservation. And, you know, as our agricultural lands become more productive, if you really imagine the future, wouldn't we want everything to come from the surface of the earth rather than the inner part of the earth? So that the more that our agricultural lands are productive, those brown and green things are providing bio products, green products, and can displace fossil fuel-based products. That's the ultimate in sustainable business development. So I think that particularly for this sector, compared to any other sector, looking at the absolute economic productivity of these lands in concert with the environment is actually the solution. But we need to make certain that profitability is front and center.
Thank you. Here's an interesting question. I assume from a student, I'm not sure. Brittany Oliver asks, what can environmental policy students, well, I would probably say students in general, what can students do to help bridge these gaps? So from a student perspective, Bill, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I think students can engage the issues. I think that there are any number of strings that one can pull that will get you into a constructive conversation with others who maybe know more than you do, from whom you can learn, and which will lead to potentially internships or professional interests yourself and jobs or graduate school. One thinks of the whole variety of energy developments that are taking place in America today that have, you know, to start with generation and go to storage and wind power, solar power. Those really make a lot of difference. I think if I were a student today, there are 2 or 3 areas that would really fascinate me. One is kelp farming, and I should point out to Brent, it is reported to be very popular among lobstermen in Maine, working with a new company that actually is cultivating kelp and selling it commercially, kelp and seaweed, because the lobstermen have, it's their off time very often, but they have a remunerative activity. There's a research on the West Coast into what's called suberin, which is a component of cork, and to the extent that it can be increased in potentially maybe even grain crops, It leads to deeper roots and soil enhancement and carbon sequestration. And very smart people at the Salk Institute are estimating there could be between 20 and 46% of carbon reduction in this technology. Now, this is not something that will be mounted tomorrow or next year, but the investments are being made in several areas of the country and the economy that can help address the problem. And by the year 2040, for example, could be making a serious contribution. The other one is extraction of carbon dioxide from the air. If you're in engineering or related disciplines, this would be, I would think, gripping, tremendously interesting. And there are several different technologies to do it. The technologies are out there. Getting them efficient and cost effective is the major challenge right now. But a very big project is being sponsored by Ernie Moniz, who former energy secretary at MIT. And these are places that one could engage with in one respect or another that I think could really advance our society.
Hey, Dan, just a quick comment. This is Brent. To the students, I think most students are not politically entrenched. I would encourage students, like Bill said, to educate themselves on the issues, but as well, work to break down the partisan divide and understand the issues themselves. The issue is important. A lot of times we disagree on the solution, but really an effort to break down the political divide. And I'd point to a group of students that are actually doing that. Benji Backer and the American Conservation Coalition, young college students who are reaching across the aisle and working to identify collaborative efforts and just work together to solve these problems. So I think, ultimately for us to make progress, we have to figure out a way to put the resources above politics.
Could I just add a word?
Yeah,
Brent's absolutely right. There is a tendency at American universities toward ideological, I don't know, extremism maybe is a word, but there was a survey done at one of the big universities recently, and a question was asked: could you work effectively with someone whom you disagree with politically on an important issue? And the answer came back majority no. Mm-hmm. Well, come on, what's education about, and how is this society going to work if compromise is eliminated from the start? So it's a lesson for students as well. It's a lesson, I think, in tolerance and in mutual understanding and making an effort even with people that you don't agree with, or maybe you don't even like.
This is Erin. I love when I get this question out students, because they always say, can I get a job in sustainability? I'm like, there aren't jobs, you have to create it. So, we're relying on you to come up with make the business case, right? And put purpose into the business models. That's at the heart of sustainability. And then I think as you're looking for a career, if you want to find a career where you care about food, you care about people, renewable energy, the ability to store climate change, and working for great people, then I think personally, my own career journey, this sector, the farm sector, is an amazing sector where you see all those things at work. And there's a lot of innovation that's happening. When you think about the next 10 years, if you want to solve climate change, you want to work in communities, and you want to do really cool stuff from your dinner plate every single night and have good conversations, then the ability to work with farmers is a really great thing.
Excellent.
Nice.
Okay, one quick answer question for you, Robert, and then I need to wrap this up. Robert mentioned involving the religious or faith community. What opportunities do you see for the faith community, especially rural churches, to engage in farm conservation innovation? This is from Jamie McGirt.
Yeah, I actually was talking to a graduate student who was interested in doing some survey work in this, and there are places where there are religious groups that have gotten interested in climate change and other work. Again, this is a really important community in rural. Frankly, I would have loved to have had more time to look into it. So I think there's actually more to learn there. There's more listening we need to do. but it clearly plays a very important role, and making some inroads into that community, I think, is going to be really, really important.
Thank you. So we need to wrap it up. Our hour and a half is gone. It goes fast. There were lots of other terrific questions on a number of issues, some policy questions about the Farm Bill, other ways of engaging people. So we won't be able to get to those today. But I think we identified at least, my favorite definition of politics is that it's the reconciliation of diverse interests in society. And there are going to be diverse interests. People are going to disagree. And so the question is, how do you design institutions and processes and educate people and so on to make it possible to work out these kinds of issues? So I hope we've made a small contribution, I hope today, and may continue to make a contribution on these issues. So thanks to Bill, Erin, Brent, Robert, our speakers today. Thanks to the Nicholas Institute and ConservAmerica for working with us on this program. Also, thanks to Danielle Miller-Wagner of the Center for Environmental Policy, who really organized all this stuff, and Charles Leggett from the SPA communications staff for allowing us to use the technology sufficiently. And thanks to everybody that participated. We appreciate your questions and your attention, and we welcome suggestions for maybe some follow-up activities to build on this. We'll send around the email for the Center for Environmental Policy. So thank you. It's good to be able to give attention to these important issues, even in the context of the current crisis. These challenges will still be there. So thank you, and have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you, Dan.